My name is Priya Anand, I am 29 years old, and I want to tell you something that took me 3 years, 2 breakdowns, 1 betrayal I did not see coming, a secret I was never supposed to find out, and 1 phone call that came at 2:47 in the morning to fully understand that the most radical thing a person can do when the world has treated them unkindly is refuse to become unkind back. This is that story, all of it, even the parts that make me look bad. Even the parts that broke me open like a walnut on concrete. Even the ending which is not the ending I expected, and which still makes me cry a little every time I think about it, but not from sadness, from something else entirely, something I do not have a clean word for yet. I want to start at the beginning, because the beginning matters more than you think. Not the dramatic beginning, not the phone call or the emergency or the moment everything collapsed for my parents, and they had no one left to dial but the daughter they had spent 3 years calling a fool, but the real beginning. The quiet one. The kind of beginning that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't feel like a beginning at all when you're living inside it, that only becomes a beginning in the rearview mirror of years. I grew up in a house in Fremont, California, where love was a thing that was expressed entirely through anxiety. My father, Vijay Anand, had come to this country from Hyderabad in 1989 with $40 in his pocket, an engineering degree from Osmania University, and a determination that burned so hot and so constant it would have frightened a lesser man into turning back. He built a life here the way immigrants build lives, with his hands wrapped around every second of every day, with sacrifices so ordinary they stopped feeling like sacrifices, with a ferocious, consuming love for what he was working toward that he had almost no language for expressing directly. He became a software engineer. He worked for the same company for 22 years. He bought a house with a 2-car garage and a lemon tree in the backyard, and he stood in front of that house sometimes in the early mornings when he thought no one was watching, and I could see from my bedroom window that he was simply looking at it, just standing there, looking. My mother, Kamala Anand, had a master's degree in mathematics from Andhra University that she had never used professionally in America. She had come here as my father's wife, and she had made a life inside that role with the same ferocity my father brought to everything else. She cooked, she organized, she remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every teacher's name, every doctor's appointment. She volunteered at the temple on Saturdays. She learned to drive in her mid-30s and treated every trip to the grocery store like a small personal victory, which it was. She was the kind of woman who ironed everything, including dish towels. She was the kind of woman who had strong opinions about the correct way to fold a sari. She was the kind of woman who showed love by feeding you more than you could eat, and then worrying about whether you were eating enough. And they were good parents. I want to say that clearly, even though this story is going to complicate that statement considerably. They were good parents in all the ways their generation and their culture had taught them to be. They were present. They were sacrificing. They worked themselves to the bone so that my brother Rohan and I could have piano lessons and SAT prep and family vacations to places they'd read about in magazines. They wanted us to be safe. They wanted us to be successful. They wanted us, in the deepest and most sincere part of themselves, to have everything they hadn't. The problem was that their idea of everything and my idea of everything did not overlap in quite the way they assumed. Rohan is 3 years older than me. He is the golden child, though I say that without bitterness now, because I have done enough therapy and enough honest reflection to understand that the golden child position is not actually a gift. It is a cage, and my brother has spent his entire adult life fighting his way out of that cage without anyone giving him credit for it. But when we were growing up, Rohan was everything my parents wanted to display. He was top of every class, he was the first in our extended family to get into Berkeley, he graduated with a computer science degree, he got a job at a tech company that my father could mention at dinner parties, while my uncles nodded with the particular reverence that people of their generation reserved for certain company names. Rohan was the proof. He was the evidence that my parents' sacrifices had worked. And I was the other one. Not because I wasn't smart, not because I wasn't capable, but because what I was capable of and what I was interested in did not map onto any template my parents had been given for what success was supposed to look like. I was interested in art, in making things, in the way a color could shift the entire emotional register of a room, in the way a product could be designed to communicate something wordlessly, in the gap between what something was and the story it told about itself. I was interested in brands, not in a shallow way, not in a fast fashion influencer way, but in the deep structural way, in the way that a company's visual identity is a kind of language, a kind of promise, a kind of relationship with everyone who sees it. I went to a state school and studied graphic design. My parents paid for it because they paid for Rohan's education and would not be seen to do less for me, but my father made it clear at every opportunity that he considered it a concession and not an endorsement. Design is a hobby, he said more than once, in the particular tone he reserved for statements he considered self-evident. You will learn to use the computer, you will get a job, you will figure out later what you actually want to do. My mother worried more quietly, which was somehow worse. She worried in the form of clipped newspaper articles about employment statistics slipped under my door. She worried in the form of questions about whether I had considered nursing instead, or accounting, or any number of things that would have made her feel that I was anchored to something solid and permanent in a world she had always experienced as precarious. I graduated in 2018. I got a job at a mid-sized branding agency in San Francisco. I was good at it. I was genuinely good at it. My designs won awards within my first year. My clients renewed their contracts. My creative director started putting me on the bigger accounts before my second year was up. I was earning a decent salary. I had a small apartment in the outer Sunset, with a view of precisely nothing except the building across the alley, which I had decorated with plants and art prints, until it felt like a place that belonged to someone who knew herself. And that should have been enough, that should have satisfied everyone, and for a while I let myself believe it did. But there was this thing I kept coming back to, this idea that had been growing in the back of my mind since my sophomore year of college, watered by every project I worked on, every client brief I read, every instance where I looked at a small business owner's brand and thought, this is wrong, this is not what you mean to say about yourself, this is not the story you want to tell, let me show you what it could be. The idea was this: there were thousands of small businesses, particularly small businesses run by women, particularly small businesses run by immigrant women and women of color, who were doing extraordinary things and communicating them in ways that were invisible. Not because they didn't have something real to offer, but because branding, real branding, the kind that builds loyalty and tells a story and makes someone feel something, was inaccessible to them. The big agencies charged fees that made those business owners' eyes water. The cheap template services produced work that looked like every other business on the block. There was a gap, and I could see it so clearly it was almost unbearable, this gap between what these businesses were and the way they were presenting themselves to the world. I wanted to build something that lived in that gap, a boutique branding studio specifically for small businesses run by women. Accessible pricing, extraordinary quality, a process that centered the business owner's actual vision and story rather than imposing someone else's aesthetic on top of it. I would call it Anokha Studio, Anokha meaning unique in Hindi, which felt right for something built around the idea that every business had an irreplaceable story that deserved to be told with precision and beauty. I planned it for 2 years before I said anything to anyone. I built the business model in the Notes app on my phone during lunch breaks. I took online courses in evenings, business accounting, contract law, client management systems. I built a website on weekends. I reached out to my first 2 potential clients, women I had met through a local small business Facebook group, months before I had any intention of leaving my job, just to see if there was real demand, just to test whether the thing I believed about this market was actually true. It was true, both of them signed on. Both of them cried, literally cried, when I showed them their first brand concepts, because seeing yourself clearly, seeing your own business reflected back with care and intelligence and real aesthetic attention, is an emotional experience, it turns out. It is something close to being seen. I saved 12 months of living expenses. I lined up 4 clients for my first quarter of business. I gave notice at my agency job on a Thursday morning in February of 2021, and my creative director hugged me and told me she'd known for a while that this was coming and that I was going to be extraordinary. Then I drove to my parents' house in Fremont for Sunday dinner, and I told them what I had done. My father put down his fork. He did it slowly and deliberately, the way he always did when he was about to say something he wanted to have wait. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked at my mother, and then he looked back at me and he said, "Priya, you left your job." "Yes," I said. "Your good, stable job." "It was good, I learned a lot, but I have a plan, Papa, I've been planning this for 2. To start a company. He said it the way he might have said to climb a mountain backwards. A studio, a branding studio. I already have 4 clients, I already have. Priya, he picked up his fork, he cut a piece of his chicken, he chewed it and set the fork down again. Your brother works at Google, he earns more than I did at the peak of my career. He has benefits, retirement, stock options. This is what I came to this country for, this is what I wanted for you both. Now you are going to tell me you left a real job to draw logos on a computer from your apartment. It's not just logos, I said, and I heard the defensiveness in my own voice and hated it. It's full brand identity, strategy, visual identity, messaging, the whole. It is a hobby, my father said, the same word he had always used, the word that was meant to end the conversation before it could properly begin. You are 30 years from retirement, you have no husband, no. Vijay, my mother said softly, a warning. No stability, and now you are going to make your living telling small shops how to design their business cards. This is not a company, this is a hobby with a name. Rohan was sitting across the table from me. He was pushing rice around his plate. He did not say anything. He did not look up. And I noticed that even then, that silence, that very deliberate keeping of eyes on the plate. I filed it away without knowing I was filing it away, the way you store things you don't know you'll need until you need them. My mother, to her credit, tried. What is this called? She asked. This studio. Anoka, I said. It means. I know what it means, she said. A flicker of something crossed her face, not pride exactly, but recognition. The word had come from somewhere she knew. Then, is there enough money? Are you sure you have enough saved? Have you spoken to a financial person? This was how she cared. Not by saying I think this is wonderful or I believe in you, but by cataloguing the practical risks, because the practical risks were the only language of love she had been given for situations like this. I understood that then intellectually. Understanding it did not make it hurt less. I have 12 months of savings, I said. I have 4 clients, I have a plan. 4 clients is not a company, my father said. And that was that. The conversation moved on. My mother served more rice. Rohan said something about a new project at work, and my father's face rearranged itself into the expression he kept specifically for hearing about Rohan's professional life, a kind of warm attentiveness, a ready smile, and I sat at the table for another hour, and a half eating perfectly spiced food and feeling as though I had become, at some point in the last 20 minutes, entirely invisible. I drove home that night through the February cold, and I sat in my car outside my apartment building for probably 20 minutes without getting out. I am telling you this because this is the moment I want you to hold on to, not the triumphant moments that came later, but this one. This 20 minutes in a dark car, outside an apartment building in the outer sunset, with the fog coming in off the ocean and the streetlights doing that thing they do in fog, where they blur at the edges into something soft and a little heartbreaking, and me sitting there asking myself whether I had just made the worst mistake of my life. I had spent 2 years planning. I had been meticulous, careful, strategic. I had numbers and clients and a savings cushion and every piece of practical evidence I could assemble that this was a real and viable thing I was doing. And in 45 minutes at a dinner table, my father had taken all of that and compressed it into the word hobby, and now it was rattling around in my chest like a stone in an empty can. There is something specific that happens when the people who are supposed to believe in you most, not even believe, just acknowledge, do not. It is not simply discouragement. It is something older and more foundational than that. It goes to a place in you that was formed before you had words for it, that place that learned what you were worth in the very first years of your life from the people who were reflecting you back. When those people look at something you have built and call it a hobby, something in that deep foundational place shifts, and you have to decide right there in the dark car in the fog whether to let it shift you. I got out of the car. I went upstairs. I made tea. I sat at my desk and I opened my laptop and I started working on my first client's brand identity, a woman named Beatrice who had a small ceramics business she'd been running out of her garage for 5 years and who had told me, when I asked what she wanted people to feel when they saw her brand, I want them to feel like they're holding something that was made by someone who was paying attention. I worked until 2 in the morning. I went to sleep. I got up the next day and I worked some more. That was my answer to my father's 45 minutes. Not a speech, not a confrontation, not a grand declaration, just getting up and working, the most unglamorous kind of defiance there is. The first year of Anoka Studio was the hardest year of my professional life, and also in some ways the most alive I had ever felt. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I do not think that is a contradiction. Beatrice became my anchor client. She referred 3 people to me in my first 6 months, and 2 of them signed on. My 5th client came from Instagram, which I had started filling with work samples and the occasional honest post about what it was like to be building something from nothing. My 6th came from a feature in a small local magazine about women-owned businesses. By the end of my first year, I had worked with 11 clients, earned slightly less than I had made at my agency job, but significantly more than I had projected, and built a portfolio that I was genuinely proud of, work that felt like mine, work that felt honest, work that I thought was actually good. I did not tell my parents any of this in real time. I tried once in the spring of that first year. I brought my portfolio to Sunday dinner on my laptop, and I showed them the ceramics brand and a bakery I'd done and a skincare line run by a Salvadoran woman in East Oakland that I particularly loved. My mother looked at it politely. My father looked at it and said, "It is nice. Is it paying your rent?" "Yes," I said. "All your bills?" "Yes." "Are you saving? You should be saving, Priya. You have no employer putting money into a retirement account for you. You have to do it yourself. Do you have a—" "I know, Papa, I have an IRA. I've been contributing." He looked at me for a moment. Then, "Good," as though the IRA, was the only thing in what I had just shown him that merited acknowledgement. As though the work itself, the actual craft, the beauty of it, the meaning of it, was a given that didn't need commenting on, a given that existed purely in service of the financial reality, which was the only reality that counted. I stopped bringing my laptop. The first year was also when I met Jolene. She came to me through a friend of a friend. She was starting a natural hair care line, had been mixing products in her kitchen for 3 years, had a name and a concept and 0 visual identity, and a dream so vivid and specific that when she described it to me in the coffee shop where we first met, I sat across from her and felt something click into place inside me, the feeling of a key turning in a lock. Jolene was brilliant. She was also, I would discover, the kind of friend who appears in your life at exactly the right moment and proceeds to hold you accountable to yourself in ways that are sometimes infuriating and always necessary. Over the next 6 months of working on her brand, we became friends, real friends, the kind built on staying up late arguing about typography and the ethics of marketing, and what it means to try to build something that actually helps people, built on her showing up at my apartment with jollof rice when I was having a bad week and me teaching her how to make my mother's dal on a Wednesday night, when we both needed something that tasted like comfort. She was the first person outside of work I had told everything to, about the business, about my parents, about the 20 minutes in the dark car, about the word hobby and what it had done to me. "Your parents are operating from fear," she told me one night with the directness that was her most essential quality. Fear dressed up as practicality, fear that looks like common sense, fear that sounds like love, but it's still fear. The question is whether you're going to let their fear define what's possible for you. "I know that intellectually," I said. "There's a difference between knowing something and having it in your body," she said. "Right now you know it in your head. When you have it in your body, you'll stop needing them to approve." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought about it every time I went to Sunday dinner, and my mother asked whether I was eating enough and my father asked whether business was stable, and neither of them asked whether I was happy or what I was working on or what I had learned. I thought about it every time I drove home from Fremont through the dark and sat for a moment in the car. The comments started at my cousin Divya's wedding in the fall of my first year. Extended family, the aunts and uncles and second cousins and family friends who existed in that particular social ecosystem of the Bay Area Indian diaspora, where everyone knew everything about everyone and achievements were currency and comparison was a love language. My Aunt Chitra, my father's older sister, was the best of them. She found me at the cocktail hour and hugged me and asked about my business with genuine curiosity, actually listened to the answer, said, "This sounds like something you were always going to do, ever since you were 6 and redesigning the covers of your notebooks." Aunt Chitra was always the exception. Everyone else was less of an exception. Uncle Praveen asked me 3 times whether I had considered going back to a real job, not because he forgot I'd answered, but because he thought if he asked it enough times, I would eventually give a different answer. Auntie Shobha, who had never worked a day in her adult life and was proud of it, asked me whether I was still doing that little art project. Mrs. Krishnamurthy, who was nobody's aunt but everyone's neighborhood authority on correct life choices, told me that she had heard my parents were very worried about me and that she thought it was very brave of me to try something like this, which was the kind of compliment that is actually a warning in disguise. I smiled, I answered questions, I drank my mocktail and complimented Divya's lehenga and danced to 3 songs and drove home at midnight and lay in bed staring at the ceiling for a long time. I do not want to make it sound as though I was passive through all of this, as though I was simply absorbing the skepticism without any response. That would not be accurate. I had a response. The response was that I worked. I worked with the particular ferocity of someone who has something to prove, and I am aware that this is not the purest motivation, that the cleanest version of ambition is the kind that doesn't need an audience, that doesn't have a chip on its shoulder. But I was 26 years old and I had been told, implicitly and explicitly, my entire life that what I cared about and what I was good at did not count as real. And I was angry. Not all the time and not in a way that consumed me, but there was a steady low burn of it underneath everything I built in that first year. A fuel source I am not sure I would have chosen if given the choice, but which kept me working late when I would otherwise have stopped, which kept me pitching clients when rejection felt cumulative, which kept me refusing to consider, even in my lowest moments, the possibility of going back. She's not serious about it, it's a phase. She'll come back to her senses. How long can you run a business on drawing pictures? My father at Divya's wedding to Uncle Praveen overheard at the bar while I was standing 6 feet away. He did not know I was there. Year 1, October. I stood at that bar for probably 30 seconds after hearing those words. My father had his back to me. He was holding his whiskey glass. He was talking about me to my uncle the way you talk about a weather forecast that hasn't come true yet, with mild impatience, with the confidence of someone waiting for reality to reassert itself. She'll come back to her senses, as though sense lived in the place I had left and not in the thing I was building. I set my empty mocktail glass on the nearest surface. I walked back to the dance floor. I danced to 3 more songs. I did not cry until I was in my car. I have to tell you about Rohan now, because Rohan is not simply the background character, he appears to be in the first part of this story. He is, in fact, one of the story's most important figures, and understanding him requires understanding something about what it means to be the golden child in a family where love and expectation have been fused together so completely that separating them is essentially impossible. Rohan and I were close when we were children. Not in an explicitly affectionate way, our family did not do explicit affection, but close in the way siblings are when they are each other's primary witnesses to the reality of their family, when they share the particular coded language of having grown up in the same specific kind of house. We knew each other's shorthand. We knew what the sound of our father's footsteps on the stairs meant about his mood. We knew which of our mother's silences were comfortable and which ones were not. We were allied, even when we were not consciously choosing to be, in the particular alliance of children who are navigating the same weather together. That alliance frayed as we got older, and the differences in our paths became more pronounced, but I had always assumed it was still there underneath, that whatever pressure the family exerted on the surface, Rohan and I still shared the private language of having come from the same place. I found out in the summer of my 2nd year of business that I had been wrong about that. The way I found out was this: I had been trying all through my 2nd year to figure out why my parents' skepticism seemed to be getting worse rather than better, even as my business was visibly, quantifiably growing. By the end of my 2nd year I had worked with 31 clients. I had been featured in 3 publications. I had a waiting list. I had hired my first contractor, a young woman named Zara who was fresh out of design school and terrifyingly talented. I had moved out of my apartment into a small but real studio space in Oakland. By any reasonable metric, the thing I was doing was not a hobby. It was a business, a legitimate, growing, sustainable business. And yet at every Sunday dinner, my father's tone remained exactly as it had been in February of my 1st year, slightly pained, slightly resigned, as though the conversation about my business prospects was a wound that had not properly healed and kept being reopened by the fact that I refused to make different choices. My mother had recently begun forwarding me job listings. Not frequently, not aggressively, just occasionally. A senior designer position at a marketing company. A brand director role at a startup, each one sent with a message that said only, "Saw this, thought of you," which was the most loving form of doubt I know. In July of my second year, I went to Sunday dinner, and the topic somehow came around to an old friend of my parents, a man whose daughter had just been made vice president at a biotech company at the age of 31, and my father said, with absolutely no apparent awareness of how the sentence would land, "That is what it looks like when a girl has real ambition." The table went quiet. My mother looked at her plate. Rohan looked at his phone. I said very calmly, "I'm going to use the bathroom," and I went and stood in my parents' bathroom for 4 minutes breathing through my nose until I was sure I was not going to say something that could not be unsaid. Then I came back to the table and finished dinner and drove home and called Jolene, and we talked for 2 hours. "I don't understand why it keeps getting worse," I told her. "It's like the more the business succeeds, the more they need it to fail, like they're committed to the narrative." There was a pause on the line. "Priya," Jolene said slowly, "does Rohan talk to your parents about your business?" I stopped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, does he ever come up in conversations you have with them? Do they reference him when they talk about your business?" "Not directly," I said. "Why?" Another pause. "I don't want to plant seeds," she said, "but I want you to pay attention, okay? Just pay attention." I paid attention. What I noticed once I started looking was a small pattern of specific inaccuracies in things my parents believed about my business. My father mentioned once that he had heard my profit margins were very thin. They weren't. They were healthy for a studio of my size, and I had never shared specific financial information with him, so the information had come from somewhere else. My mother asked me once whether I had thought about the legal liability of working with so many different clients, a pointed question that assumed I had not set up proper contracts, which I had from the very beginning, because I had done the work of learning how to run a business properly. She seemed surprised when I told her I had a contract attorney I worked with. "Oh," she said, "Rohan said he wasn't sure you had thought about that." Rohan said. I sat with that for 2 weeks. I did not want to believe what I was starting to understand, because the story I had been telling myself was that Rohan was simply disengaged, that he stayed quiet at dinner because he did not want to get in the middle of a conflict, that his silence was neutral, that it was the silence of someone who had learned not to stir things up. But the silences that are neutral do not produce specific, pointed misinformation in the people around them. I confronted him on a Saturday afternoon in August, at the coffee shop near his apartment in San Jose that we occasionally used for what passed in our family as sibling bonding. I did not accuse him. I did not go in hot. I simply asked, as directly as I could manage, what he had been telling our parents about my business. He looked at me for a long moment across the table. Then he looked away. Then he looked back. And I knew the expression on his face. I had grown up with that face, and it was the expression of someone who has been caught in something they cannot deny but are not ready to admit to. "I haven't been saying anything negative," he said. "I've just been sharing concerns." "Whose concerns?" "Mine. I was worried about you, Priya. When you quit your job, You told them my profit margins were thin. You told them you weren't sure I had contracts in place. Those aren't concerns, Rohan. That's misinformation. That's telling them things that aren't true." He looked at the table. I thought. What did you think?" The coffee shop was playing something soft and jazzy. A woman at the next table was laughing at something on her phone. Rohan looked at his coffee cup. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, lower, less controlled, with something raw and unexpected underneath it. "I was scared you'd fail," he said. "I thought if they had a realistic picture of the risks and then it didn't work out, they wouldn't be as devastated. They wouldn't have gotten their hopes up." "You were protecting them from hope." "I was protecting them from," he stopped. He pushed his coffee cup in a small circle. "You don't know what it was like for them when I was starting out. Papa doesn't handle uncertainty well. He worries in ways that don't look like worrying. He doesn't sleep. Mama cries when she thinks no one is watching. I thought if I just managed their expectations. By lying to them. By being realistic. The reality is that I have been profitable for 18 months and have a waiting list and a team member. That's the reality, Rohan. What you were telling them wasn't realistic. It was, I don't know what it was, some story you needed to believe." I looked at him. He still wouldn't look at me. "Did you want me to fail?" He looked up then. His face was complicated, not defensive in the way I had expected. Something more honest than that, something that cost him more. "No," he said. But I think I needed you to need me. I think I needed to be the one who made it, you know. And if you made it too, a different way, a way I didn't understand, a way that didn't look like what I did, I think I didn't know what to do with that. I think I needed you to need me. Rohan, at a coffee shop in San Jose, in a moment of honesty I did not know he was capable of. Year 2, August. We sat there for a long time after that. The jazz kept playing. The woman kept laughing at her phone. I thought about what it had cost him to say that. I thought about the cage I had named at the beginning of this, the golden child's cage, and what it looks like from the inside. I thought about how the same parents whose anxiety had stunted me had also, in their own way, stunted him, had taught him that there was only one template for success, and that anyone who succeeded differently was not succeeding at all, but threatening. Had taught him that love was a finite resource that could be diminished by sharing it. Had taught him, without meaning to, that his position at the top of the family hierarchy was something that required defending. I did not forgive him that day. I was not ready, but I understood him, and understanding is where forgiveness eventually begins. We did not speak for 4 months after that conversation. I did not tell my parents about it. I did not tell them what I had learned, because some part of me recognized that the narrative my brother had been feeding them was not the root cause of their skepticism. It had simply been fertilizing something that was already there. The root cause was older and more complicated, and had to do with fear and love, and the particular damage that happens when the two are never separated. The fall of my 2nd year into business brought what I would later come to call the dark quarter, 3 months during which everything seemed to be pointing in the wrong direction at once, and I had to learn, in a very visceral way, the difference between a setback and a failure. In September, I lost my 2 largest clients in the same week. One of them was acquired by a larger company that brought their own internal branding team. The other, and this one strung more, was a woman named Phoebe, who ran a mid-sized sustainable fashion brand, and who had been my most high-profile client up to that point. Phoebe left for a bigger agency after I had spent 4 months deep in her brand development process. She said she needed a team with more capacity. What I later discovered, through the small world gossip of the Bay Area creative community, was that she had taken the brand strategy and mood boards I had developed for her to the bigger agency and used them as the brief, essentially taking my work and paying someone else to execute it. There is no clean legal category for this. The strategy documents I had built for her were technically her property. As part of a contract clause I had not scrutinized carefully enough in my eagerness to land a big client. I consulted with my contract attorney and she confirmed what I already suspected. There was nothing I could do. I could send a letter. I could make noise. But I could not get the work back, could not prevent her from using what I had built, could not even publicly call her out without risking a defamation claim from someone who had significantly more money than I did. I took a day off. I sat in my studio and I did nothing for 8 hours, which for me is the closest thing to a complete shutdown that I allow myself. I looked at the plants on my windowsill and the coffee cup on my desk, and the mood boards I had pinned to the wall for 3 other clients, and I let myself feel it fully, the injustice of it, the specific kind of pain that comes from your work being taken and relabeled as someone else's, the fear that ran underneath it because those 2 clients represented nearly 30% of my revenue. Then I got up, made tea and figured out the path forward. I revised my contracts, all of them. I worked with my attorney and we rebuilt the contract structure from the ground up, new clauses around intellectual property, new milestone structures that protected my work at each phase, new language around what happened if a client terminated mid-process. It was expensive and time-consuming, and I did not sleep well for 2 weeks, and by the end of it I had a contract that was, my attorney said, one of the most airtight she had seen for a studio of my size. In November, Zara, my contractor, told me she'd been offered a full-time position at a larger agency. She was apologetic and kind about it. She was also right to take it. It was a significant opportunity, and she was 23 years old and needed the stability. I told her so genuinely and helped her negotiate her salary via text message and cried in the bathroom after she left because she had been extraordinary and I had not been ready to lose her yet. In December, my landlord raised my studio rent by 40%. I spent a week doing the math from every angle and eventually decided I could not justify it, and at the end of January I moved my operation back to my apartment, which felt not like failure exactly, but like failure's next-door neighbor, which is humiliation. The particular humiliation of something that felt like progress being reversed, of going backwards in a way that everyone could see. My parents found out about the studio somehow, probably from Rohan, though I had no evidence of that and by then was trying to stop assuming the worst, and my father called me, which was unusual. He did not call often. He called on birthdays and occasionally on holidays, and once when he had a health scare and needed to tell me about an upcoming procedure in the most matter-of-fact way he could manage. This call was different. "I heard you gave up the studio," he said. "I moved back to working from home," I said. "It's a practical decision. The rent increase was significant and the overhead wasn't justified." "Priya," he paused, "it is okay to admit when something isn't working." "It's working, Papa. I made a strategic financial decision." "You can always." "I know," I said. "I know I can always come home. I know there are job listings. I'm okay. I'm not giving up. I'm adapting." A long pause, then. "Your mother is making your favorite curry next Sunday. She wants you to come." "I'll be there." And that was the whole call. The curry was an invitation, and also an apology, and also a peace offering, and also a statement of love that could not be made directly. And I drove to Fremont and ate the curry, and it was, as it always was, extraordinary. And my father talked about an article. He had read about the economy, and my mother talked about the temple's fundraising event, and nobody mentioned the studio or the rent or the strategic financial decision. And at the end of the evening, my mother pressed a Tupperware of leftovers into my hands and held them for a second longer than necessary. And that was what love looked like in our family, and I had to decide whether it was enough. I want to tell you something about grief, about the particular grief of being a child who has decided to stop performing for their parents. Because that is what I had to do, somewhere in the middle of my second year and into my third. I had to grieve the version of this story where my father finally understood what I was building and told me he was proud, where my mother stopped sending job listings and started sending congratulations, where Sunday dinner was a place I arrived without armoring up. I had to grieve that story because it was not happening, and because holding on to it as a possibility was doing me more damage than releasing it. This is not a triumphant realization when you are inside it. It does not feel like freedom when you first arrive at it. It feels like loss. It feels like accepting a diminishment of the relationship you were supposed to have, the family you were supposed to come from. It feels like swallowing something that doesn't go down clean. I started therapy in January of my third year. My therapist's name was Dr. Ananya Pillai, which I chose partly on purpose. I wanted someone who would understand the specific cultural textures of what I was navigating without my having to explain them from the beginning. Dr. Pillai was precise and warm and absolutely merciless in the best possible way, and she said to me in our third session something that rearranged a wall inside me. "You keep telling me you need them to understand in order to feel legitimate, but you are already legitimate. The question is whether you are going to wait for their permission to know that." I am not going to pretend that I heard that sentence and was immediately transformed. That is not how therapy works. That is not how anything works. What happened was slower and messier, and involved a lot of sessions and a lot of crying in my car, and a lot of going to Sunday dinner, and coming home and asking myself over and over again what I was actually looking for there, whether I was going because I loved my parents or because I was still, on some deep and not fully conscious level, hoping that this would be the Sunday they would finally give me what I had been waiting for. Slowly, I stopped hopping for the specific thing. I started going to Sunday dinner differently, going because these were my parents, because the curry was real, and the love underneath the awkwardness was real, because the lemon tree in the backyard was real, because there were things about this family that were mine in ways I would not get back if I walked away from them. I started going for what was actually there rather than for what I wanted to be there. It did not fix the relationship, but it changed the weight of it. And changing the weight of it gave me energy back that I had been spending on the hope and the disappointment cycle, and I put that energy into Anoka Studio, which in my third year began to do something I had believed in but not fully anticipated. It began to fly. Year 3, I want to do this justice because I have talked so much about the hard parts, and the hard parts are not the whole truth. In February of my third year, a feature about Anoka Studio ran in a mid-tier but well-read business publication that focused on women entrepreneurship. The writer had found me through Instagram and had spent 3 weeks interviewing me and 2 of my clients. The piece was 4,000 words, and it was one of the most accurate pieces of journalism I have ever read about my own life. It got the thing I was trying to do right, got the gap I was filling right, got the emotional dimension of the work right, the way that helping a woman see her own business clearly is, in some essential way, about helping her see herself clearly. I went from 50 inquiries a month to 400 inquiries in the first week after that piece ran. I hired 3 people. Full-time employees, not contractors, a junior designer, a brand strategist, and an operations manager who had previously worked at a mid-sized agency and who turned out to be one of the best decisions I have ever made. Her name was Vivienne, and she was 53 years old and had been through enough in her professional life to be entirely unintimidated by anything, and she walked into Anoka's studio and within 3 months had built internal systems that made the place run like something twice its size. I moved into a new studio space. A real one in a building in Oakland that I could now afford, a bright, long room with west-facing windows and exposed concrete, and a kitchen that actually had a dishwasher, which felt obscenely luxurious after 2 years of hand-washing mugs. I put a big plant in the corner and prints on the wall and the Anoka logo, which I had redesigned 3 times over 3 years, getting progressively more confident and more precise with each iteration, on the frosted glass of the front door. I stood in front of that door one morning before my team arrived, and I looked at it the way my father used to stand in front of the house. Just standing, just looking. By the middle of my 3rd year, Anoka Studio had a team of 6. We had worked with over 100 clients. Our average client contract had tripled in value from my first year. I had been asked to speak at 2 conferences. I had turned down an acquisition offer from a larger agency, turned it down politely but unequivocally, because the thing I had built was not something I was willing to dissolve into someone else's structure. And throughout all of this, the hiring and the growth and the feature and the conferences and the acquisition offer I turned down, I did not call my parents to tell them. I did not drive to Fremont with my laptop. I did not seek the moment of vindication I had fantasized about in my first year, the moment where the evidence was undeniable, and they would have to say, yes, okay, we were wrong, we see it now. I had grieved that moment. I had let it go. I went to Sunday dinner and I ate the curry and I talked about ordinary things, and I let the business be something that existed in my life without needing to be validated by anyone else's recognition of it. It was, I think, the hardest thing I did in 3 years of hard things. My Aunt Chitra knew. She had been following me on Instagram from the beginning, had liked every post, had commented occasionally with things like, so proud of this one orange heart, that made me feel seen in a way that mattered. She called me on a Thursday afternoon in October and said, Priya, I know you're not going to bring this up yourself, but I need you to know that what you've built is extraordinary. Your grandfather, your father's father, he tried to start a business when he was young, you know, in Hyderabad. It didn't work and it broke something in him. I think your father is carrying that. I think he loves you and he's scared in a way he doesn't have the language for. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear for a moment. He tried to start a business. A small textile shop. He'd saved for years. It failed in 18 months. Your grandfather never talked about it, but your father watched it happen. He was 12 years old and he watched his father become a different person after that. Smaller, quieter, she paused. I'm not saying this to excuse him, I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know the whole shape of the thing. The whole shape of the thing. I thought about that phrase for days. I thought about a 12-year-old Vijay watching his father's dream collapse, absorbing the lesson that dreams are dangerous, that ambition without certainty is reckless, that the safest thing is the steady thing, the predictable thing, the thing that cannot fail because it doesn't try. I thought about what it must have cost my father, coming to America with $40 and building a life, not the life of the dream he might have had, but the life that was safe enough, solid enough, real enough. I thought about how love, when it grows in the shadow of a wound, often looks like fear to the people it's trying to protect. I did not call my father. I was not ready for that conversation, but something in me shifted, not toward forgiving him for what he hadn't given me, but toward understanding him as a person whose life had shaped him into someone who genuinely could not give it, and who was loving me with what he had, even when what he had was not what I needed. The call came at 2:47 in the morning on a Thursday in November. My 3rd year in business, 8 months after the feature, 6 months after my team of 6, 3 years, 1 month and 12 days after I had sat at my parents' dining table and told them I had quit my job and my father had put down his fork. I was asleep, The phone rang and I looked at the screen and saw my mother's name, and my first thought, the first thought you always have when your parents call at 2:47 in the morning, was that something had happened. Someone had died. Someone was in the hospital. "Amma," I said, using the word I hadn't used for her since I was small. It came out automatically, the way things come out when fear has stripped away the adult layers. "Priya," her voice was strange, not the flat, controlled tone she usually used, something thinner, something with a tremor in it that I had never heard before and that frightened me more than any of her silences ever had. "I'm sorry to call so late, I'm so sorry." "What happened? Is it Papa? Is he?" "He's here, he's okay, don't worry about that." A breath, a pause that lasted long enough for my heart to beat 5 or 6 times in a row. "Priya, we need help, we need money. I didn't want to call you. Papa didn't want me to call you, but I don't know what else, I don't have anywhere else." "Amma," I said. I sat up, I turned on my lamp. "Tell me what happened." What happened is a story that requires going back in time, and this is the part of this story that broke me open in a way that nothing else had. Not the dark quarter, not the Phoebe betrayal, not the 4 months of silence with Rohan, not the years of Sunday dinners where I was invisible. This broke me open because of what it revealed about the shape of things, about all the things I had not known were happening beneath the surface of the family I thought I understood. What happened began, as many of the most damaging things begin, with a private shame. My father, in the middle of his career, around the time I was in high school, around the time he seemed most certain and most settled, had made a financial decision that went wrong. He had invested a significant sum of money, more than he had told my mother, in a business venture with an old friend from Hyderabad, a man who had reached out with an opportunity in real estate development that seemed solid and legitimate, and that my father had believed in. He had believed in it partly because of the friend, and partly because of the old hunger, the old thing that his father's failure had buried but never killed. The hunger to be someone who had made something, who had taken a risk and been vindicated for it. He had done it quietly, without telling my mother the full amount, because he knew she would worry, because he thought it would resolve itself before it needed to be a conversation, because men of his generation, who had survived as much as he had often confused silence with strength. The venture failed. The friend disappeared, not dramatically, not with any theatre, just gradually became unreachable and then permanently unreachable. The money was gone. It was not a devastating amount by some metrics, it would not bankrupt them, it would not take the house, but it was enough that it had altered the trajectory of their retirement in ways my father had been trying for 15 years to compensate for. He had taken on extra consulting work in his late 50s. He had deferred retirement twice. He had moved money around and juggled obligations in a way that my mother did not fully see and that Rohan did not know about at all. And in the last year, as he finally, truly retired, as the juggling stopped and the full accounting became unavoidable, the weight of it had come due. There was a debt. Not to a bank, not to anyone dangerous, but to a cousin of my mother's family, a man who had loaned my father a private sum to help cover a gap during the worst of the compensating years, a loan that my father had always intended to pay back, and that had instead grown, slowly and uncomfortably, into the kind of obligation that sits between family members and calcifies into something no one talks about at dinner. The cousin had called. He was not cruel about it, he was not threatening, but he needed the money now. He had his own situation, his own needs, and my father in retirement did not have it, not without liquidating investments in a way that would leave them with a much smaller cushion than they had planned for. Not without calling the daughter they had spent 3 years calling a fool. "Papa didn't want to call you," my mother said. "He sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours tonight before I picked up the phone. He kept saying he couldn't ask you. He said he didn't have the right." I sat in my bed in Oakland with the lamp on at 2:47 in the morning, and I listened to my mother's voice do things I had never heard it do. And I felt something happening in my chest that was several things at once: grief and compassion and anger, and something else that I didn't have a clean word for, a kind of expanding, like a room getting bigger than it was supposed to be, like the walls moving outward. "How much?" I asked. She told me. It was significant but not staggering. I had more than that in my business account. "Amar," I said. "I know," she said. The 2 words carried everything: the apology, the acknowledgement, the years of job listings and put-down forks, the word hobby and the phrase real ambition, the Sunday dinners where I was invisible. All of it in 2 words. "I will transfer the money tomorrow morning," I said. First thing, I will transfer it and you can take care of the cousin and we don't need to talk about whether it's a loan or a gift or anything like that. It doesn't matter what it is. You needed help and I'm able to help. That's all this is." A long silence. When my mother spoke again, her voice was very different from any tone I had heard from her before. It was smaller and younger, and it had nothing in it that was trying to manage anything. "Priya," she said, "your father wants to say something. Will you talk to him?" "Of course," I said. There was the sound of the phone changing hands, a silence that stretched for several seconds longer than any silence I had shared with my father since I was a child. And then his voice, not the authoritative voice, not the voice of the man who put down his fork and called things by their names. A different voice, one that had been scraped clean of all its armor. "Priya," he said. "Papa's." He started again. He stopped again, I could hear him breathing. "I am sorry," he said, "for what I said, for what I have been, how I have been, about your work, about what you are doing. I was wrong, I was," a long breath. "I was afraid, I have been afraid a long time, and I took it out I put it on you, and it was not fair, it was not right." I was crying, I had not known I was going to cry. The tears were just there, suddenly running down my face in the dark, and I didn't try to stop them. "Papa," I said. "I am proud of you," he said. The words came out slightly broken, slightly tentative, as though he was not sure after all this time whether he still had the right to say them. "I have always been proud of you. I did not know how to, I did not know what to do with it, but it was always there, it was always." "I know," I said, and in that moment, sitting in the lamplight at 2:47 in the morning with my face wet and my heart doing something enormous and complicated, I found that I meant it, that it wasn't a consolation, that I did in some deep and fundamental way know. That Aunt Chitra had given me the language for it, and Dr. Pillai had given me the space for it, and 3 years of showing up and building and refusing to become smaller had somehow made me capable of receiving it. Not the version I had needed at 26, not the vindication I had imagined, but this. My father at 2:47 in the morning, saying the word proud in a voice that had been scraped down to its true thing. "I'll send the money in the morning," I said. "Get some sleep. I want to tell you what happened in the days after that, because the days after matter." I transferred the money the next morning. My mother sent me a text that said simply, "Thank you, Kanna." Kanna, a Tamil endearment she hadn't used for me since I was very small. I stared at it for a while. I called Jolene. I told her the whole thing from the beginning, and when I was done she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "So you answered?" "Of course I answered. A lot of people wouldn't have." "I know," I said, "but I'm not." I stopped, found the words. "I'm not who they raised me to be, I mean that in the best possible way. They raised me to be cautious and fearful and to measure love in terms of obligation and payback. And I love them deeply, but I don't operate that way. I chose not to operate that way. So when they called and they needed something, it wasn't a calculation. It wasn't me deciding whether they deserved it or weighing up the years of put down forks. It was just they needed help and I could help. That's the person I chose to be." A pause. "You know what's wild?" Jolene said. "You didn't become that person despite them. You became that person because of them, because of the work you had to do to get out from under what they put on you. All that weight you had to lift off yourself made you strong enough to lift them too." I sat with that for a long time. Rohan called me the following week. He had heard from my mother. She had told him what happened, apparently in considerable detail, including my father's apology on the phone. Rohan's call was short and not fully articulate, but it was real. He said he was sorry. He said he had been doing some work, his own kind. He was seeing a therapist, had been for 5 months, was starting to understand some of what had driven him to do what he had done with our parents. He said he didn't expect anything from me. He said he just needed to say it. "I know," I said. "I seem to be saying that a lot lately. Thank you for calling." "How's the business?" he asked, the most ordinary question, the one he had been not asking for 3 years. "It's doing really well," I said. "We have a team of 6 now, we're profitable and growing. I'm speaking at a conference in January." "That's Priya, that's incredible." He sounded in that moment genuinely impressed, not obliged to be, not performing it, genuinely. "I mean it, I should have said that years ago, I'm saying it now." "It counts," I said, and that was also true. The Sunday dinner 2 weeks after the phone call was different. I drove to Fremont through the November dark and the fog coming in off the bay. and I parked in front of my parents' house with its 2-car garage and its lemon tree that had gone dormant for the winter, and I sat in the car for a moment. But this time it was different from every other time I had sat in the car. This time I was not arming up. This time I was not preparing to absorb the disappointment. I was just sitting, just breathing, just arriving. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She must have been watching for the car. She stood in the doorway with the kitchen light behind her, and she looked at me for a moment. Really looked at me, not a glance, not the quick assessment of whether I had eaten enough, but a long look that had something in it I had not seen before, and then she opened her arms. My mother has never been a hugger, not in my memory, not in 30 years of Sunday dinners and birthday dinners and every other occasion. She will press a Tupperware of leftovers into your hands. She will call you Canna when she's moved, but she does not hug. She hugged me that night. She stood in the doorway and put her arms around me and held on, and I could feel her breathing against my shoulder, and the kitchen smelled like everything it had always smelled like, turmeric and cumin and the particular sweetness of fenugreek. And I stood in that doorway and held my mother back, and felt something very large and very long-standing begin, at last, to release. My father was at the stove. He had been helping with the cooking, which was not something I had ever seen before in my 30 years of life. He was stirring something and he turned when I came in and he looked at me and he nodded. Just that, a nod. But it had in it everything the word proud had had at 2:47 in the morning, and I nodded back, and we both understood. We ate dinner. The food was extraordinary. It was always extraordinary, and this was not different except that I tasted it fully for the first time in years, without the ambient noise of the hurt making everything slightly dim. My father asked about the studio. He asked real questions, not the practical metric questions of how much and how stable, but actual questions. What kind of work was I doing right now? What did the conference talk cover? Had I thought about writing? He had read about the feature. He had read the whole 4,000 words of the feature, apparently in the month since it ran, without telling me. Why didn't you say anything? I asked him. He looked at his plate, a long pause, then in his careful, precise way, I didn't know how to say what I wanted to say, so I said nothing. It was a mistake. I have made many mistakes in this direction. He looked up. I am trying to make fewer. This is, I think, the most emotionally vulnerable thing my father has ever said to me. It is also, in its way, the most useful, not a declaration, not an apology, not a performance, but a statement of intention. A person acknowledging the pattern and committing to the work of changing it. That is the best version of an apology, I think. Not the one that's most dramatic, but the one that's most true. There is something I have not told you yet, that I need to tell you now, because it is the twist in this story that I did not see coming and that rearranged everything, including everything I thought I understood about my mother. 3 weeks after the November dinner, I went back to my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon to help my father set up a new laptop. While I was there, my mother asked if I wanted to see something. She took me upstairs to their bedroom, which I had not been in since I was a child, and she went to the closet and came back with a shoebox. Inside the shoebox were printouts, hundreds of them printed on regular printer paper, stacked carefully, organized by date. I picked up the first one. It was a screenshot of my Instagram page from March of my first year in business. The second was a screenshot of a client testimonial I'd received. The third was the small local magazine feature, printed in full. The fourth was someone else's post that had tagged me in a compliment. The fifth was a screenshot of my business website from year 2, when I'd redesigned it. I kept going. The whole shoebox was like this, a complete chronological archive of everything I had put into the world over 3 years, every feature, every tagged mention, every client post that celebrated their new brand, every conference announcement, every piece of evidence that what I was doing was real and growing and mattered. My mother had been tracking all of it, printing it, keeping it, not on a phone, not digitally, but on paper in a shoebox in a closet, the way her generation kept the things they needed to be able to hold. I looked up at her. She was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, watching me go through the box, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was trying not to cry, the very slight tightening of the jaw. The breath held a fraction longer than natural. "Amar," I said, my voice was not steady, "how long have you been doing this?" "From the beginning," she said. "From when you first posted about the studio, before that from when you were in school. I have a box for your school projects too, and Rohan's, I keep everything." "But you sent the job listings. Papa said it was a hobby, you never." "I was scared," she said, simply, the same word my father had used on the phone. I have always been scared for you, not because I didn't believe in you, because I did. I believe in you so much, Priya, and the world is so. She stopped, steadied. When you believe in someone, when you love them, you know how much they have to lose. And I didn't know how to hold both things at the same time, the pride and the fear, so the fear came out and the pride stayed in the box. The pride and the fear, so the fear came out and the pride stayed in the box. My mother, Kamala Anand, on a Saturday afternoon in the bedroom I remembered from childhood, holding a shoebox full of everything I had ever made. I put the box down, I crossed the room. I held my mother's face in my hands the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable, and she let me, which is its own kind of miracle, and I said, I know, Amma, I know. Because I did. Because Aunt Chitra had told me the shape of it, and Dr. Pillai had helped me make space for it, and 3 years of building something real had given me enough ground under my feet that I could stand in this room and receive this without being destroyed by it. The pride had been there all along, in a box, in a closet, on printed paper, hundreds of pieces of evidence that my mother had seen every single thing I had done and had never, not for a single moment, stopped watching. It was not the same as being told. It was not a substitute for being told. But it was real, and it was hers, and it had been there in the dark of the closet, keeping everything I'd built documented and preserved with the care that my mother brought to everything she loved. And understanding that, truly understanding it, not just intellectually but in my body, the way Jolene had once said was the only way it counted, changed something in the architecture of the last 3 years. Did not erase the years, did not make the put-down forks or the job listings or the word hobby disappear, but changed what they meant, showed me the thing behind them. I want to talk about what this story is not, before I tell you what I think it is, because there are versions of this narrative I have heard and read and been offered as a template that I do not think are honest. This story is not the story of a dramatic reconciliation. My parents and I did not, after the November phone call and the shoebox and the hug in the doorway, suddenly become a family where approval is freely given and fear has been replaced with trust, and Sunday dinner is a place where everyone says exactly what they mean. That is not what happened. What happened is more complicated and less cinematic, and I think more true. My father still does not fully understand what I do. He has tried harder, he asks questions now, real ones, and he reads things I send him, but there are moments when I can see him reaching for the vocabulary he was given and finding it insufficient, and I have learned to have grace for those moments rather than despair. My mother still worries. She is a warrior, she will die a warrior. The worrying is its own love language, and I have learned to receive it as such without letting it determine my choices. Rohan and I are rebuilding. It is slow and it is not linear, and there are conversations that go better than expected and conversations that hit old nerve endings in ways that neither of us entirely predicted. He is doing his own work. I am doing mine. We are not the siblings we might have been if our family had been differently structured, but we are becoming, I think, the siblings we can be from where we are, and that counts. This story is also not the story of my business success being the thing that changed my parents' minds. I want to be very precise about this because I have seen this version of the narrative, the one where the skeptical parents are won over by the undeniable metrics, where the vindication comes in the form of numbers large enough to silence the doubt, and I find it troubling. Not because success doesn't matter, but because if the lesson of this story is prove them wrong and then they'll love you correctly, then the lesson is still about earning love through performance. And that is the cycle I spent 3 years breaking. My parents were not won over by my success. They were reached by their own crisis, which forced them into a kind of honesty that success could not have produced. The success mattered because it meant I had the resources to help them when they needed it. But the change, the real change, the thing that cracked open the space for an honest conversation, that came from vulnerability. From my father at 2:47 in the morning saying I don't have the right. From my mother in the doorway opening her arms. From the shoebox in the closet that was, in its own quiet way, the most honest thing that had ever been said in our family. And what I did, what I chose to do when the phone rang, was not the strategic move of someone who had calculated that helping now would produce goodwill later. It was simply the choice of someone who had worked hard enough on themselves to be free of the tit-for-tat ledger that damaged relationships run on. I was not owed an apology before I helped them. I was not withholding until the words were said. I answered the phone and I said I'll send the money in the morning because I had enough ground under my feet, enough self-knowledge, enough freedom from the old cycle, to simply be who I had chosen to be, without needing the situation to be different first. That is the whole of it. That is what I am most proud of, more than any client or any feature or any conference invitation. Not the business, not the success, the person I chose to become while building it. I want to tell you about my grandfather now. About the textile shop in Hyderabad that failed in 18 months and turned a man smaller and quieter and changed the trajectory of everything that came after. I did not know my grandfather well. He died when I was 9, and by then he was already very old and very still, a man who sat in a particular chair in my grandmother's house and looked at things without appearing to be inside them. He had a gentle face. He smelled of camphor and something else, something warm and woody, and his hands were very large and very rough, and when he held mine they were surprisingly light, as though the roughness was all on the surface and underneath there was barely anything at all. My father worshipped him in the way that children worship fathers who have disappointed them, completely, and without quite knowing why, and in a way that made it impossible to see the disappointment clearly, to name it, to do anything with it except carry it forward and call it love. I think about that textile shop sometimes, about the man who had the dream of building something, who saved for years, who put everything into the attempt, who watched it fail and came out the other side of the failure not as a person who had tried and learned and would try again, but as a person who had been proven right about the danger of trying, who took that proof and gave it to his son, wrapped in all his love, the way you give a child a coat for a climate you are afraid they might encounter. And his son put the coat on, and wore it his whole life, and tried to put it on me. And I took it off. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic gesture, but inch by inch over 3 years, in a small studio in Oakland, building something that I believed in with the specific stubbornness of someone who has been told their whole life that stubbornness is not a virtue. I think my grandfather would have understood what I built. I think somewhere inside the man who sat in that chair and looked at things without appearing to be inside them, there was still the person who had once believed in the textile shop, who had felt the particular electricity of building something from nothing, who had known what it was to stand in front of something you made and simply look at it. I think that person never entirely disappeared. I think he just got buried under the failure and the fear and the long decades of pretending the dream had never existed. I hope he knows, wherever he is, that the granddaughter he barely got to hold went ahead anyway. I hope it brings him something. There is a thing that happens when you build something real, something that comes from an honest place in you, something that was shaped by your own specific history and perspective, and all the accumulated weight of who you are. There is a thing that happens with the people it touches. It touches them in the place that is their own specific history, their own particular weight. And something passes between you that is not quite a transaction and not quite communication, but something older than both of those. A recognition, a resonance, the feeling of being a tuning fork struck by someone who is playing exactly your frequency. This happened over and over with my clients. It happened with Beatrice, whose ceramics brand I built in my first year. She called me 2 years later to tell me that she had just been approached to do a collaboration with a major lifestyle retailer, and that none of it would have happened without the brand, and that what the brand had really done was help her understand what she was actually doing and say it clearly enough that other people could understand it too. It happened with Jolene, whose natural hair care line was now in 400 stores, and who had recently turned down a corporate acquisition that would have changed everything about what she'd built. It happened with a woman named Nadia who had a one-person catering business and who cried when she saw her brand for the first time and said, "I didn't know I could look this serious. I always thought I looked like a hobby." That word again, hobby, the dismissal that is dressed as realism, the wound that is handed from person to person and generation to generation, disguised as practicality until someone decides to stop passing it on. I built Anoka Studio to help women tell their stories clearly. But what I understand now, 3 years and 100 clients and one phone call at 2:47 in the morning later, is that the story I was really telling was my own. That every brand I built for someone else was, in some essential way, practice for the brand I was building for myself, not the visual one, not the website and the logo and the Instagram grid, but the internal one. The story of who I was and what I was capable of, and what I refused to be diminished by. The business was the surface. Underneath it was a person learning, slowly and not always gracefully, how to be free. I am going to tell you about the last Sunday dinner before I finish, because it is important and because it happened recently, 6 weeks ago, as I am writing this, and because it is the moment that made me want to write all of this down. My parents, my brother, his wife Deepa, and I sat around the same table where this story began. The same chairs. The same tablecloth my mother has used since 1998. The same smell of turmeric and fenugreek and the sweet char of curry leaves in hot oil. My father had helped cook. This had become a new thing, him helping in the kitchen, one of the small changes that had happened quietly in the weeks since November without anyone having to announce it. At some point during the meal, my father put down his fork. He did it the same deliberate way he always did when he was about to say something he wanted to have weight. But the weight of this was different. The quality of it was different. It did not have the bracing quality of something about to land. I have been reading about your studio, he said, to me directly across the table, not to anyone else, to me. I have been reading the things your clients write about it, online. I have been reading the article. He cleared his throat. There is a client, a woman, who wrote something I want to read to you, if you don't mind. He had it on his phone. He had saved it. He read it, slightly haltingly, in the cadence of someone reading something in a language they are fluent in but that still does not feel fully theirs, and it was a testimonial from a client named Funme who had a sustainable textile brand and who had written, "Working with Priya changed not just how my business looks, but how I understand what I am doing." She asked me questions no one had ever asked me about my own work, and she listened to the answers, and she built something that said exactly what I meant. For the first time in 5 years of business, I feel like the outside matches the inside. My father finished reading. He put his phone down. He looked at me. "The outside matches the inside," he said. "This is what you do." "Yes," I said. He nodded. He picked up his fork. He started eating again. And that was it. No further speech, no dramatic declaration, no complete and final arrival at understanding. Just those 5 words. "This is what you do," said by a man who took years to learn how to say them, across a table that had held the whole weight of this family's particular way of loving, in a house where the lemon tree was bare and the winter light was thin and the curry was, as it always was, extraordinary. It was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything. I have been writing this for 4 hours. It is nearly 3 in the morning, which I notice is close to the time the phone rang that Thursday in November, and maybe there is something in that, maybe the small hours are where the true things live, the things too heavy or too real for daylight, the things we say and hear when the armor has come off because there is no energy left to keep it on. I am writing this for a few reasons. I am writing it because I needed to put it somewhere outside myself to see it whole, to understand what happened and what it means. I'm writing it for all the people who are currently sitting in dark cars outside apartment buildings at some version of 2 in the morning, absorbing the word hobby or the put-down fork or the forwarded job listing, trying to figure out whether what they are doing is real or whether the people who are supposed to love them are right and it isn't. I want to say to those people, stay in the car for a few more minutes if you need to, and then get out, and go upstairs, and make the tea, and do the work. I am writing it because the question I have been asked most often since November, since the story got out among the people who know me, is this: how did you do it? How did you answer the phone? How did you help them after everything they did? And I have been trying to find the right way to answer that question for weeks, and I think what I want to say is this. I did it because I am not who they raised me to be, not as a condemnation, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact that is also a statement of gratitude. They raised me, as best they could, with the tools they had. And the tools they had were shaped by fear, their own fear, inherited from their parents, inherited in turn from the particular history of people who had come from somewhere hard and landed somewhere uncertain, and decided that safety was the highest value because safety was the thing that had been most precarious. They gave me those tools. And I used them, not in the way they intended, but in the way I needed to. I used the fear as information, used the doubt as fuel, used the weight of their disappointment to understand exactly how much I would have to build inside myself to become someone who didn't need their approval to know her own worth. And then, when they needed something, I found out that the person I had built was someone with enough love that didn't need to be earned back, enough ground under her feet that she could extend a hand without needing one first, enough freedom from the old ledger that generosity was simply the natural response to someone in need, even when that someone had spent years making things difficult. I am not who they raised me to be, I am better, and I say that without arrogance because it is not a competition, it is simply the way it should work. The next generation should be better, should be less afraid and more whole and more capable of the kind of love that doesn't require conditions, the kind that gives because it has something to give and not because it expects something in return. That is the point of all of it, the sacrifice, the immigration, the $40 and the 22 years and the lemon tree and the Tupperware of leftovers, not to produce copies of the same fear in new containers, but to produce people who are free enough. Eventually, to be generous. I am those people. I am trying to be anyway. I am working on it every day with the same attention I give the work, with the same refusal to stop that got me through the dark quarter and the Phoebe betrayal, and the 4 months of silence and every Sunday dinner where I showed up in my armor. The person I am building is the most important project I have ever undertaken, and it will not be finished in 3 years or 30, and the measure of its success is not a metric anyone else can read from the outside. It is whether, the next time someone needs help, I can answer without calculation, whether I can give without keeping score, whether I can love the difficult people in my life, the ones who carry their fear into every room and call it wisdom, with enough spaciousness that their fear does not become mine. I think I am getting there. I am not there yet, but I am getting there. One more thing, one last thing, and then I am going to sleep. A week after the November phone call, I went to my parents' house on a Tuesday afternoon, not Sunday, just a Tuesday, just because. My mother was in the kitchen. My father was in the garden, doing something to the lemon tree. It turns out that even in winter there are things to do to a lemon tree, small maintenances, small attentions that keep it ready for spring. I stood at the kitchen window and I watched my father in the garden. He was wearing the old jacket he always wore for outdoor tasks, the olive green one that had been in my memory since I was probably 5 years old, that was soft at the elbows and slightly too large for him, and that he refused to replace, because he said it was perfectly functional, and replacing it would be wasteful. He was moving carefully and deliberately around the tree, the way he moved around everything, with the particular intentionality of a man who has learned that nothing maintains itself, that everything real requires constant, unglamorous attention. And I thought about how this man had carried a wound his whole life that he didn't know he was carrying, that had come from watching his father fail at the same thing his daughter would later succeed at, that had bent his love into a shape that sometimes hurt the people it was meant for. And I thought about how he had still shown up every day for 22 years of work, and every Sunday of his children's lives, and every lemon tree in every winter. And I thought about how showing up imperfectly, with all your fear and all your damage and all your insufficient vocabulary, is still showing up. I went outside, I stood next to him. He looked at me slightly surprised. It was a Tuesday, I wasn't supposed to be there. Then he looked back at the tree. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Pruning," he said. "If you prune correctly in winter, the spring growth is much stronger. You remove what is old and finished so that the new growth has room and light." We stood there for a moment in the thin winter sun. I could smell the cut branches, green and sharp and clean. "Can I help?" I asked. He looked at me, a long look, the kind that comes from a face that has finally, with great effort and great lateness, learned how to actually see who is standing in front of it. "Yes," he said. He handed me the pruning shears. "Here, I'll show you." And he did. That is the whole story. That is everything. I am Priya Anand. I am 29 years old. I built a business my parents called a joke, and I answered the phone at 2:47 in the morning, and I became, through 3 years of the most ordinary and extraordinary kind of work, someone who could do both of those things without it costing me who I was. If you are out there in your dark car, I want you to know, the thing you are building is real. The question of whether it will be recognized is separate from the question of whether it is real, and you do not have to wait for the first to proceed with the second. Build the real thing, become the real person. The recognition, if it comes, will come in its own time and in forms you probably didn't predict, in a phone call at 2:47 in the morning, in a shoebox in a closet, in 5 words across a dinner table, in a father handing you pruning shears in a January garden. And if it never comes, if the people who should see it never do, then be the person who sees it anyway. Be the person who shows up anyway. Be the person who answers the phone at 2:47 in the morning, not because you were given enough to make it easy, but because you chose to have enough. Because you built enough. Because becoming free, becoming genuinely, groundedly free, is the most loving thing you can do for anyone, including the people who made it hardest. I am not who they raised me to be. I am so grateful for that, and I am every day a little bit more grateful for them. Both things at the same time, That, I think, is the whole of what I have learned. Edit, I was not expecting this to reach anyone outside my usual circle. Thank you for every comment and message. To everyone who asked, yes, my parents know I wrote this. My mother read it and called me and cried a little and then asked if I had eaten dinner. Some things don't change, and I have learned to love that too. To the question several people have asked about whether I would ever consider writing more, maybe. One story at a time. This one took 3 years to live and 4 hours to write, and I am not sure anything I make will ever feel more true than this. But I will keep building. I will always keep building. That much has not changed and will not change.